Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second Material History Seminar Series for 2025. I'm Luke James from Deakin University, and I'm delighted that you've been able to join us. Today, we'll be discussing new histories of the Overland Telegraph, and we have two notable experts to present for us. But first, please let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of culture and country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people who may be joining us from elsewhere today. So a little bit about Material Histories. Material Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Old Treasury Building, Deakin and Australian Catholic University. In each discussion, we explore an aspect of material history through an object or series of objects. The seminars are open to anyone interested in material history, and for topics, we hope to cast the net widely in terms of both time and space. So if you're interested in contributing, please get in touch. We'll add a link for where to do so at the end of the seminar. This particular seminar is presented as part of the program of the Australian Heritage Festival in Victoria. So today's topic is Objects of Connection, the Overland Telegraph. In 2022, a virtual exhibition was launched to mark 150 years of the Overland Telegraph Line, which was a collaboration between Australian Catholic University, the History Trust of South Australia, the State Library of South Australia, and the South Australian Museum. The exhibition retells the line's significance through a more inclusive cultural narrative beyond its place in European-centred colonial history. In particular, it seeks to emphasise First Nations perspectives on the line's paths through Aboriginal Country, and highlights the vital role of non-European actors in its construction. It reveals the line's important transcultural history, both as a tool of colonial expansion and as a complex zone of cross-cultural contact and exchange. The exhibition draws on the collections of three of South Australia's cultural institutions, and the reinterpretation of items of material culture is a key aspect of the exhibition's approach. To introduce our first speaker, Mandy Paul is responsible for the management of the South Australian State History Collection. Understanding and sharing complex and contested histories has been a thread running through her career, informing her work of over 3 decades as a social history curator, museum director and collections manager, as well as a consultant historian on native title claims. Mandy holds postgraduate qualifications in history and museum studies and has published widely on Australian social history, museology and native title. Mandy is also a member of the State Records Council and a visiting research fellow in the School of Humanities at the University of Adelaide. Over to you, Mandy.
Thank you, Luke. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Tatania or Adelaide on Kaurna country, and to acknowledge Kaurna people's ongoing connection with, care for and custodianship of this place. So as Luke mentioned, this project, it was a joint project, but I'd like to start by mentioning that it was actually led by Amanda Nettlebeck, who you'll be hearing from shortly, who at the time was sharing her time between Australian Catholic University and the University of Adelaide. And some of the partners on this project, including me and Amanda, were already working together on a different project, an ARC-funded linkage on South Australia's frontiers. This website was launched in 2024, and some of you might be interested to look that one up too. So the Overland Telegraph Line project was a joint one. It was between Australian Catholic University, the State Library of South Australia, the History Trust of South Australia and the South Australian Museum. And funding of $26,500 was received from Australian Catholic University, and we were notified of the funding in November 2021. So we were keen to complicate the default historical narrative of the Overland Telegraph Line as a technological triumph, and wanted instead to work on a social and cultural, and particularly a transcultural history. The virtual exhibition was launched on the 22nd of August 2022, which was not coincidentally 150 years to the day since the completion of the OT line. And really importantly for what we were doing, the project was collections based. So research into each of these collections was undertaken by the relevant institution. Writing was a team effort, and that built on the collection and knowledge strengths of each partner organisation and various team members. And the History Trust built the digital story platform, the website. And there's a full list of credits at the very end of the virtual exhibition if you want to go and have a bit of a look. So I'll just start the body of what I want to say with a little bit of a recap about the Overland Telegraph Line. What was it and why was it important? So the line made possible almost instantaneous communication across the Australian continent, from Adelaide to Port Darwin, that connected the Australian colonies to the rest of the British Empire and onwards to the rest of the world. The line was built in 3 sections, imaginatively called the Southern, Central and Northern sections, between 1870 and 1872. The usual focus on the line as an engineering feat and the focus on driving force Superintendent of Telegraphs Charles Todd is understandable, and the OT line is often referred to now as the internet of its day. But of course, the line didn't create the first line of communication through the continent's interior. Aboriginal pathways of communication, trade and exchange had crisscrossed the continent for millennia. It did, however, facilitate a European overland route of access across the country following the 1862 track of John McDouall Stuart, and that became a catalyst for further colonisation, cross-cultural encounter, including conflict, and the formation of new kinds of relationships. So work on the Overland Telegraph Line project started in the last quarter of 2021, and the first step, as I mentioned, was research into the collections of the participating organisations to locate relevant material and think about how to interpret it anew. After extended discussion, we divided the virtual exhibition into 5 sections. One on John McDouall Stuart's expeditions as the precursor and introduction, and then a section for each of the southern, central and northern sections of the OT line, and a concluding and reflective section that we called Afterlives. Given the tight timeframes and the budget, we used a subscription-based image-rich digital story platform called Shorthand to deliver the digital exhibition, including images and maps. So it's a really good platform that enables quite dynamic digital storytelling rather than building a website from scratch. For the History Trust, the focus was on John McDouall Stuart, because we have in the State History Collection a fabulous range of objects related to Stuart and his expeditions. And we complemented these with other items, including drawings by Stephen King from other collections, including the State Library of South Australia and journals of the expedition. Critical to the History Trust's contribution to the OT Line project was that we used the funding to extend the employment of First Nations curator Adnyamatna woman Jacinta Kulmatri. It was Jacinta's research into and reinterpretation of the Stuart material that enabled the virtual exhibition to start from an engaged First Nations perspective, problematising and complicating the heroic colonial explorer narrative to pose questions about how his expeditions and the OT line that followed its route a decade later were integral to the claiming and colonisation of the Aboriginal lands through which they ran. This built on and was complemented by work Jacinta and First Nations colleague Arundel woman Jade Turner had been undertaking, bringing new perspectives to bear on the History Trust's colonial collections. This really changed how the rest of the team understood, in particular, the sub-collection known as the Historical Relics that had come into the History Trust in the 1980s from the Art Gallery of South Australia, and which comprises over 300 items closely associated with the history of colonisation. The Stuart items are part of this sub-collection. And here's just a bit of a visual representation of the interpretive approach that we were trying to take. This is the central section of the OT line, and we used a fade technique to try and make what's a pretty obvious point. John McDouall Stuart led a series of expeditions from the edges of claimed country in the colony of South Australia northwards between 1858 and 1862. On his final attempt, he succeeded where Burke and Wills had failed, reaching the northern coast and returning, exhausted and very sick with scurvy, among other things, in December 1862. The hero's welcome for him and his team had to be delayed until January, when they were well enough to get back on their horses and back into their old clothes and parade through the packed streets of Adelaide. And in one of history's ironies, this celebration was held on the same day as the funeral of Burke and Wills in Melbourne. But it was this heroic narrative that we were working to complicate, to retell the history of Stuart's travels through country. I'll start by talking about mapping and naming, and it's a really obvious point to make, but every feature really of the country that Stuart passed through was already named and known. Stuart was a surveyor. He was mapping not only routes across country, but also prospective country for European occupation and exploitation. His wealthy sponsors and backers were particularly interested in land suitable for pastoral and mining endeavours. Stuart later used his maps as leverage in his applications for land as reward for his expeditions. Land that was granted, as Jacinta noted, without consultation with its owners, Adnyamatha and Arabana people. And it was the same with the names of his backers, such as the Chambers brothers and William Fink, that Stuart inscribed the European presence on his maps and on the landscape. As Jacinta wrote, through his mapping, Stuart erased Aboriginal names of places, instead honouring those who were vital to his explorations. These maps and journals contained information that would enable his sponsors to determine how profitable the land might be for European land use. It was the key to claiming Aboriginal land and increasing their wealth. This place, Itakarawara, or as Stuart called it, Chambers Pillar, is a good example. Stuart wrote in his journal on the 6th of April 1860, "It is a pillar of sandstone, standing on a hill upwards of 100 feet high. I've named it Chambers Pillar in honour of James Chambers Esquire, who, with William Fink Esquire, has been my great supporter in all my explorations." Aranda traditional owners know Itakawara as the knobtail gecko man. In 1870, Stuart's map led members of John Ross's party to the landmark during their survey to identify the official route for the Overland Telegraph Line. During this visit, John Ross and Alfred Giles, leaders of the party, carved their names into the sandstone, beginning a tradition for many who came after. As noted in the website, this is cultural collision literally written on the landscape, and also irreversible. Stuart's skill with and care for the horses that enabled his expeditions is often part of the narrative about the man. Someone who knows a lot more than I do about horse riding explained to me once that the diminutive size of Stuart's spurs indicated both these things, his skill and his care for his mounts. As an aside, Stuart also named or renamed features of the landscape after his horses. For example, Polly Springs, near a river which is known as Fink River, strangely, in Central Australia. Jacinta's perspective highlighted a very different aspect of Stuart's horse husbandry. She wrote, "Stuart's need for water was exacerbated by the horses he relied on for transport. As he travelled, each step was taken towards the next available water source. He used Aboriginal people's footprints and smoke as ways of finding water. On 26 June 1859, not far from his previous interaction, Stuart met with some more people who were most likely Arabana. He asked them where he could locate water. They showed him, and Stuart allowed his horses to drink. The horses completely emptied the well, prompting Stuart to ask for another location. The people let Stuart know that there was no more, likely concerned that the horses would leave nothing. It was not only Stuart's presence in areas of water that was concerning for Aboriginal people. His horses could take all remaining water, making them dangerous. Stuart placed himself near water sources nightly, at times scaring people away from their camps so that he was closer to those sources. Or put more succinctly, Stuart's horses could clear a well of water, so their presence was dangerous in a landscape where water was sacred and scarce. So this quart pot in the collection is from the 1862 expedition, and we've also got some lovely matching pannikins that go with it. So usually quart pots were used to get water for both horses and men. They're usually interpreted as an indicator of water scarcity, of how parched the landscape was and how perilous the journey for expeditioners and their horses. A new look enabled us instead to foreground the perspective of those who are living in that landscape sustained by the available water sources and the impact of the expeditions on the water sources, the landscape and its owners. We can see this really as a harbinger of what was to come. A fresh look also enabled similar reinterpretation of accounts in Stuart's journals of fire. While he was at Roper River on the 26th of June in 1862, Stuart wrote, "They are not to be trusted. They will pretend the greatest friendship one moment and spear you the next. They have been following us today, but keeping on the other side of the river and setting fire to the grass as they go along. I wish it would rain and cause the grass to become green so as to stop them burning. Stuart frequently tracked what he called native smokes to water, but also kept an ever-watchful eye on smoke as evidence of fire and interpreted it as a threat. However, Jacinta noted he was unaware that he was witnessing Aboriginal land management. This is one of 3 of Stuart's rifles that we have in the State History Collection. One of them was given to Stuart by Governor Richard MacDonnell, who commented, quote, "The best proof of your courage is to be found in your judicious forbearance on so many previous occasions and your avoidance of all unnecessary collisions with the native heretofore." So the arms the expeditioners carried were both for shooting food for the pot and for defence and offence against those whose country they were traversing. Stuart began his expeditions with a reluctance to use his rifle around people, but on his final expedition he began to use it as a show of power. He started to use his rifle to shoot, even when he was not at risk. Stuart wrote of an encounter at Mount Hay on the 15th of March, 1862, quote, "I had the party prepared to receive an attack, but when they saw us stationary, they approached no nearer. I ordered some of the party to fire close to them, to show them that we could injure them at a long distance if they continued to annoy us. But they did not seem at all frightened at the report of the rifles, nor the whizzing of the balls near to them, since they still remained in a threatening attitude." The shift in Stuart's use of firearms can be interpreted as an effect of the cumulative nature of his expeditions and escalation of contact. On each journey, he followed his previous track, and on the later journeys, he encountered people who demonstrated back to him with gestures the effect of his guns. Stuart's expeditions were not only a precursor to the Overland Telegraph Line, they laid its foundation. While Stuart recorded the potential for mining and stock, he also recorded suitable places for river crossings and telegraph stations, and reported on where there was suitable timber or poles. Following Stuart's successful crossing of the continent, South Australia pressed its claim to the country between its northern boundary and the coast, and in July 1863, the Northern Territory was annexed to South Australia. South Australia then succeeded in securing a route for the Overland Telegraph Line. Constructed largely along Stuart's route, it made Adelaide the hub of a communications network connecting the Australian colonies with the rest of the British Empire, Europe, and the world. And as we've also tried to demonstrate, the world changed irrevocably for the Aboriginal people whose country Stuart had passed through, as the repeater stations became outposts of European colonisation, and pastoral stations, townships, and mining settlements spread outwards from the line, bringing cross-cultural encounters and conflict. Amanda's now going to take up the theme of cross-cultural encounters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandy, and what a wonderful first part to today's seminar. I'll now introduce Amanda Nittlebeck, our second speaker. Amanda is Professor of History at the University of Adelaide and the current Australia-Japan Foundation Visiting Professor in Australian Studies at the University of Tokyo, which is in fact where she joins us from today. Her fields of research include a focus on the application of colonial law to Indigenous people, including through policing and the courts, and the history and memory of Australia's frontier wars. Her last book, Indigenous Rights and Colonial Subjecthood, won the 2020 Australia and New Zealand Law and History Society Legal History Prize, and she's also a member of the South Australian Libraries Board and current chair of the editorial board for the journal Australian Historical Studies. Thank you very much, Amanda. Over to you.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Mandy. I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional owners of the lands where I normally live and work, although I'm joining you today from Tokyo. As Mandy said, our aim with this project was to capture a sense of the Overland Telegraph Line as a transcultural frontier above all, as an enabler of colonial expansion and a meeting point for new kinds of cross-cultural encounters and relationships. So we really wanted to tell a story of the line as a force of cultural change rather than an engineering project, and the way that as a physical line, as well as a line of communication, it worked to remap Indigenous country as colonial space and bring all sorts of new economies and materials, animals, and forms of governance into the inland. We're perhaps still most familiar in Australia with the Overland Telegraph Line as a technology of the Victorian era, which, very much like the railway, had a transformative effect on 19th century societies. We wanted to show something more culturally diverse about the telegraph line's impacts, but because our project was entirely based, as Mandy said, on the materials which are held in state collecting institutions in South Australia, we were very mindful of the fact that those materials tend to reflect European perspectives and collecting practices in and of themselves. So our challenge was to try to read the South Australian collections in a way that would foreground the lives and the agencies of other groups of people who traversed or intersected with the line, particularly the Indigenous communities whose lands it went through, and the Muslim Cameleers who worked and lived along the line. So in my section today, I'm going to talk about the photographic collections that we drew on from the State Library of South Australia. And here I'd just like to mention the work of Jeremy Siebold, who is the Indigenous Archives Collection Manager at the State Library of South Australia, who worked with us on drawing out the State Library's collections of maps, photographs, and documentary records, which went into this digital exhibition. But today I'm going to limit myself to talking about how these photographic records give us a glimpse into the histories of the Afghan Cameleers who carted the materials that built the Overland Telegraph Line. After that major engineering project was brought to fruition, some of these men returned to their homelands, but others remained and became an integral part of the transcultural townships, which we now refer to as Garn towns, that developed around the telegraph stations and railheads. And they married into both Indigenous and European communities, raised families, ran businesses, and lived the rest of their lives in Australia. European colonists referred to the Cameleers generally as Afghans, as a kind of generic term, but these men came not only from Afghanistan, but also from present-day Pakistan, from Kashmir, from the Punjab, and from other provinces of the Northwest British Indian Empire, which means that some of these men were British subjects, while those who came from Afghanistan were not. But regardless of whether they were British subjects or not, European colonists usually regarded them as foreign because they were predominantly Muslim and perceived as racially different. So for our project, a question was what the photographic records of their journeys and the inland Garn towns that they helped build can tell us about the threads of colonial citizenship or ideas of colonial citizenship and nation building in late colonial Australia. Historians of visual culture have written about the ways that photography created a new language of citizenship in the late 19th century, being mindful of the fact that that's a vernacular term. Australia was only peopled by British subjects or non-British subjects. There was no such thing as citizens in the late 19th century, but there was a vernacular understanding of citizenship, which visual culture can help us to understand. Photographs can then help to produce and reflect back visual narratives about the nature of colonial citizenship or a concept of it through a relationship between people, the communities they inhabit, and the colonial state. For instance, in relation to late 19th century Australia, Jane Lydon has written about how photographs of Indigenous people work to organise certain kinds of narratives about Indigenous people's place within the settler state, whether as people who were positioned on the fringe of settler society or positioned as a new class of British subjects who were supposedly to be assimilated within a, quotation marks, better settler colonial future. So whether implicitly or explicitly, race has always provided what she calls a visual marker of belonging in photographic narratives of colonial citizenship and nation building. And we see this in the photographic history that's left of the Overland Telegraph Line as a kind of pioneering engineering project in the making of colonial modernity. So for instance, in this early photograph of the Peak Telegraph Station, which is in the southern section of the Overland Telegraph Line, we see an implicit story of pioneering achievement that we're all inherently familiar with. This photograph was taken in the same year that the telegraph line was opened. It shows the newly built landscape, peopled by Europeans in Victorian dress, standing in an outback setting, which they're in the process of transforming into a space of colonial activity and supposedly of modernisation. But apart from this kind of visual narrative of pioneering, the library's photographic collections also draws together a visually rich history of the central role of Afghan cameleers in Australia's late colonial pioneering projects. As a group, the cameleers represented the face of mobile trade that prevailed across late 19th century regional Australia. They were first recruited in the 1860s when camels were used to support inland exploration projects and pastoral development, and they were then recruited for the construction of the Overland Telegraph Line in the early 1870s. The Central Australian Railway began construction in 1878, and it more or less followed in the path of the Overland Telegraph Line. So by the 1880s, Afghan camel merchants were proprietors of their own carrier businesses, which took goods and mail and building equipments and virtually anything that was needed along an interior network of camel supply routes that crossed through the Australian interior, linking the telegraph stations and railhead towns to inland pastoral stations and mining camps. The repeater and pastoral stations along the Overland Telegraph Line became the departure point for other overland expeditions that then moved out east and west of the line. As we know, exploration expeditions are typically remembered by the names of their European leaders, like here the Ernest Giles expedition of 1875. But the success of those expeditions fundamentally depended upon the skills and knowledge of Aboriginal guides and Afghan cameleers. So this photograph records the expedition of Giles's 1875 expedition across the Great Victoria Desert, which left from the Beltana Telegraph Station, which we just saw in the last photograph, and was supported by camels. The party included 2 Aboriginal guides, including the young Wurrungu man, Tommy Oldham, who's seated at the front here, and the Afghan cameleer, Mohammed Salat, who was already experienced expeditioner. He had been on Peter Egerton Warburton's 1873 expedition west from the telegraph line across the Great Sandy Desert. One of the most active Ghan towns was the railhead township established at Hergot Springs, which is in Dairy Country, roughly halfway between the Beltana and Strangway Springs telegraph stations. John McDouall Stewart had stopped at this place because of its natural springs, and he'd named it after a member of his expedition, Joseph Hergot. Established Ghan towns like Hergot Springs reflected the transcultural nature of inland colonial Australia, where Aboriginal, Afghan and European communities lived side by side. The Aboriginal woman and the Afghan children in this photograph aren't identified by name in the State Library's catalogue information, and that itself broadly tells us about the colonial nature of these photographic records, which were taken by European colonists and held in their family collections. But the European woman is identified as Margaret Hiddle, who was the wife of the local storekeeper at Hergot Springs, who owned the gramophone and played it for local concerts and public events. So we see in this photo something of a glimpse of everyday social relations in inland towns like this. The photo is part of the collection made by the Hiddle's daughter, Alice Mary Hopewell, who grew up in Hergot Springs and in the surrounding region, and she later married the telegraph station operator, Edward Hopewell. Alice Hopewell was herself a keen photographer, and the State Library's collection of her photographs show dozens of local scenes around Hergot Springs and family photographs of the European, Afghan and Aboriginal families who lived there. This photo is one of a number of her photographs which showed how communities like Hergot Springs relied fundamentally on camels for leisure activities and other kinds of everyday business, as well as for the inland carrying trade. Another photograph in the Alice Hopewell collection shows Dervish Beeger and his wife Amelia outside their homes at Hercote Springs. Dervish Beeger here was a successful cameleer and a landowner at Hercote Springs, and at the time this photograph was taken, roughly around 1910, he was about 50 years old, and he ran his own successful camel carrying business. As I mentioned, cameleers were generally known as Afghans, but he was an Indian British subject who had served in the Indian British Army. Christine Stevens has written about the domestic world of such interracial marriages in Ghan towns like this, and she suggests that for cameleers' wives, life in the Ghan towns was relatively isolated, not only because the towns were remote from urban centres, but also because the carrier work overland on camels took the men away for 2 or 3 months at a time. But she also suggests that women found tight-knit communities through these marriages and an economically dependable lifestyle. The role of the cameleers in driving forward the economic development of the inland was simply not a visible part of Australian national history through most of the 20th century. But at the time that it was most active, it was well recognised. That's roughly from the 1880s through the early decades of the 20th century. As one press editorial put it in 1885, nearly the whole of the inland carrying trade was undertaken by the so-called Afghans and their camels. So because the cameleers were indispensable to growing pastoral and mining economies in late 19th and early 20th century Australia, they became integrated, at least partly, into a late colonial narrative of belonging and pioneering. But even so, their position in settler colonial society, both as Muslims and as so-called Asiatic, which was the derogatory term used at that time, made them susceptible to discrimination on a daily basis. We see something of this, as well as a story of resistance, with the history of the mosque at Hercote Springs, which was built by the Cameleer community in 1882, and it's one of the earliest documented mosques in Australia. The mosque was supplied with groundwater from the natural spring, where the Muslim community could wash before daily prayers. But in 1898, access to the spring became a matter of dispute between the Afghan community and particularly the local police constable, who threatened to have the mosque pulled down. A leading member of the Afghan community, Ghuni Khan, organised a petition to the Commissioner of Police, which resisted having the freshwater diverted away from the mosque on grounds that the Afghan community held rights as taxpayers, they held land and property, and were entitled to the legal protection of the police. And ultimately their petition was successful and the mosque was retained along with its groundwater. Perhaps the most prominent camel proprietor in colonial Australia was Faiz Muhammad, and we see a photograph of his camel team leaving the Murray railway line near Hercote Springs here to go all the way north to Tennant's Creek. Faiz Muhammad was born in Kandahar in Afghanistan, so he wasn't a British subject, but he spent much of his early life in British India before emigrating to South Australia around 1870. Throughout the 1870s, he managed the camel breeding station at Beltana Station, which was one of the southernmost telegraph station depots. And in 1883, he established his own camel depot at Hercote Springs. The carrier firm he established with his younger brother, which was called Faiz and Tide Muhammad, operated on an expansive scale, and it contracted dozens of cameleers and imported hundreds of camels. In 1893, they expanded their business into Western Australia, where they built supply routes to the goldfields. Their camel strings, like the one shown here, sometimes exceeded 50 camels at a time, and they carried tons of merchandise at any one time. When Taig Muhammad was killed in 1896, Faiz continued the business alone, and a story about the success of his business featured in the press in 1898. It described his carrying trade as one of the largest in the world, and it described Faiz Muhammad himself as a gentleman, an exemplary citizen who'd earned widespread esteem and was a pioneer of the Afghans in Australia. Despite this, when Faiz Muhammad applied for naturalisation as a British subject in 1896, his application was rejected because colonial governments were then refusing naturalisation to so-called Asiatic aliens, despite the fact that there was nothing under naturalisation law at that point to prevent their naturalisation. Faiz Muhammad appealed the decision, pointing out that, in his words, nearly the whole of my life has been passed under the British flag. He enjoyed good fellowship with the European community, and he contributed as a pioneer to Australia. Even so, he was again denied naturalisation, and he never achieved naturalisation as a British subject. He eventually returned to India, where he died in 1910. So I'll just finish up by returning to that question about what the visual language of colonial citizenship in these photographic collections might tell us about the place of Cameleers in the cultural and economic life of late colonial Australia. Even though the Cameleers faced considerable discrimination, we can see in this photographic record something about the pervasiveness of camels in running the economies of the interior, and something of the ordinary nature of everyday social relationships in the Ghan towns. And we can see the extent of the Cameleers' contribution to what until now has been, or until recently has been, a largely Eurocentric history of Australian nation building. And I'll finish there. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that wonderful second part of the presentation. And thank you both for such a skillful reinterpretation of photography, collections and documentary evidence to really reveal and recenter the experience of First Nations people of events on their land, but also alongside those of other people marginalised by the dominant colonial narratives that you've sort of articulated so well. So Amanda and Mandy, if I could just first of all invite you to, if you have a question for one another, I'm very happy to begin with that.
I've got one for Amanda. Amanda, I was really struck by the sort of discursive strategy of the newspaper referring to Faiz Muhammad as a pioneer, and then him taking that up in his appeal when his citizenship is denied or not, his claim is not successful. Have you had any thoughts about how stretchy that term is and how it gets deployed in those kind of circumstances?
The term pioneer, do you mean, or the term citizen?
No, sorry, the term pioneer, it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I think the term pioneer was broadly used in the colonial press in a way that overlaps with the way that late colonial discourse also used the term citizen. Legally, of course, there was no such thing as a citizenship status in colonial Australia. That legal citizenship wasn't born for us until after the Second World War. But the language of citizenship infused late colonial discourse, as did the language of pioneering. And I mean, I think it is very interesting that people themselves, so kind of non-European colonists or settlers like Muhammad, as well as the sort of European colonial press, recognised these men as good citizens and good pioneers, but colonial governments kind of denied them that legal status. I think there was just a very strong tension between the institutionalised racism of late colonial society, which became more and more embedded down in law and government policy, and a sort of social discrimination as well. So it's not as though the Cameleers did not face discrimination, but they were also in their own time recognised as good citizens and good pioneers.
And that word, I would observe, is only, as time went on in the 20th century, became whiter and whiter in its usage.
Yeah, I would agree. Less so in the late 19th century. On that, question if you could elaborate on for relating to the whole project, as well as the material collection that you and Jacinta were working with. And of course, McDowell Stewart's exploration expedition equipment is like the quintessential material cultural collection of colonisation. Could you talk a little bit more about how you and Jacinta worked with the challenges of decolonising what is such a fundamentally colonial material collection, and how a collection like that can yield a different perspective as well as resist, you know, a decolonising perspective?
Other people may or may not know that the collection that we have of Stuart material is everything from his smoking cap and his coral cravat ring to these more obviously expedition objects, including compasses and his field glasses, you know, snaffle bits and so on from the horses. And it really, I think you're right, Amanda, I think it is in a way the quintessential collection about colonialism. We also have in the collection Light's Plan of the City of Adelaide, which is another which has been subjected to this wonderful reinterpretive process by First Nations people who are really keen on rethinking things. So it was something I'd been thinking about for a while, but it really took the kind of the perspective of First Nations curators to actually just be really bold about it, I guess, and say, well, you have to think about, you know, if Stuart's scaring people away. You know, there's an incident in one of Stuart's journals where he deliberately scares people from their camp so that he can camp next to the waterhole, and then he starts looking around and notices that they were busy grinding grain, and he kind of thinks, oh, that's interesting, and then just goes on the next day. But Jacinta was able to bring a really thoughtful interpretation to that, which made us think about what would it have been like to have been scared away from your camp by these monsters on horseback. Because there are, and I guess I should say one of the other resources that we drew on was that there are a few oral history accounts that were collected by Ted Strello in the 1920s from old Aranda men who remembered Stuart or Stuart's parties coming through, and talked about how extraordinary these strange hybrid monsters of men on these big animals, and it wasn't just the animals that had hard hooves, it was the men also had these hard hooves and left these very strange tracks. So I guess bringing back some of the strangeness of the encounter was a really good start to try and rethink those otherwise very ordinary objects like the quart pots.
Thanks very much, both. I do have a few questions rolling in. I might just start with one question from one of our anonymous attendees. Their question relates to the Charles Todd expedition. And they asked, is there any documented evidence that his expedition was involved in any violent conflicts between the First Nations people in the regions they passed through between Adelaide and Darwin?
So I think what you're referring to, I think, is the survey parties that went ahead of the construction parties for the Overland Telegraph Lines in the southern, central and northern sections. I'm not familiar enough to answer that question definitively. I'm not familiar enough with the primary sources that were written by the surveyors and those who moved along. But one of the images that I used in the presentation and that is in our virtual exhibition is the watercolour of John Ross's party in the central section, and then there's a group of armed Aranda men that the drawing shows that the Ross party was unaware of this other party. You can only assume what happened next. But yes, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar enough with all the first-hand accounts. And I would also say that I am pretty familiar with the Stuart journals. Occasions on which people fired to show strength or in response to feeling threatened. No one went off and checked what the outcome of those encounters were. And later there's this series of expeditions. On the final expedition, Stuart's party met people who very clearly demonstrated that they knew to them, back to the party, very clearly demonstrated that they knew what the result of rifle fire was.
Thank you, Maggie. Prue has asked or noted that there was a picture of a group of Indigenous people facing the expedition approaching, and asks, did that result in any conflict? And says it looked quite threatening.
I think that's the same one that we were talking about, the Ross encounter, and I can't answer that definitively, sorry. I'd need to go back and have a look at the primary sources. This is one of the delights of this project, was that different people wrote different sections, and we drew on the particular expertise of different people in the different institutions. I wasn't one of the researchers and writers of that particular section, so I'm not deeply familiar with the sources.
I think it's worth adding, if I can just add, that other than the Ross Party encounter and McDouall-Stewart encounters that Mandy's mentioned, there is always, I think, the records are infused with the possibility of a violent confrontation. So whether confrontation occurs or not, there's a tension in the survey parties. The survey parties were all instructed kind of not to engage with Aboriginal communities, but of course engagements took place, and those engagements were not necessarily confrontational, but the idea that you would have these new groups of people going through and that the local people would not engage them in some way, or these two sides would not be able to engage at all, doesn't seem very realistic, although that was always scripted into the survey instructions. I think, if we move away from just sort of trying to track, what were the outcomes of these confrontations, it's still important to envisage the air of tension that these survey parties were sort of living with, and that Aboriginal people were living with.
And thanks, Amanda. I might also just pick up that those things aren't just consigned to the past either. So one of the examples of that we use in the afterlives section is an account of a consultation that was held for in that process that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the regional consultations. And in 2012, a statue of John McDouall-Stewart was erected in Alice Springs without consultation with local Aboriginal people, Aranda people whose country had been by then determined by native title. But and it's a statue of John McDouall-Stewart that shows him with his rifle, and local people were outraged by the erection of that statue and by the lack of consultation. And the travels of Stewart were discussed in association with the violence that came later to the centre. So the fierce frontier conflict that was present in Central Australia from the period of the Overland Telegraph Line to the Coniston Massacre in 1929, really, and then in different ways since then, local people, now still make that association that Amanda's talking about.
Thank you very much, Mandy. In fact, that segues really nicely to a question from Margaret, who asks, in working on this project, were you aware of the ways in which communities now living along the Telegraph Line remember their history, and have those communities been interested in your retelling?
I can say something about that. I mean, we would have really liked to have expanded this project out into a oral history project. I mean, I think that work is kind of partly being done through other collections and projects. So for communities that live along the line, it's not as though, the history of cross-cultural contact along the line has not ever been explored through other means. And Of course, the Overland Telegraph Line itself produced then a whole new wave of economic encounters, particularly between Indigenous communities, and along the railway line that followed, tourists, scientists, anthropologists, collectors, language collectors, etc., etc. So it's as though the telegraph line produced a whole new series of relationships which have been explored, and those collections are available in other places. Our limitation was a funding limitation, which limited us to just using the collections that we had in the collecting institutions, and so we couldn't produce any new work to gather together oral histories or kind of further data that would engage with how communities remembered the Overland Telegraph Line, although I think that it's a really rich area that still there's plenty to do there, because of course the line passes through the entire continent. So there is a lot of memory along that line.
Thank you.
Did you have anything further, Mandy, that you wanted to
just that we did hatch a plan to apply for an ARC to do just that, but to apply for a linkage grant, but we didn't actually get that far with it. But it would have been good.
Yeah, I left ACU and yeah.
But I mean, I know from my work on native title claims in South and Central Australia that the OT line and the changes that followed in its footsteps are certainly, they're not forgotten in First Nations communities up and down the line, nor the Cameleer families, proudly point to and remember their histories as well.
And another aspect of the memory of the line is, I guess, like also the built landscape. So how has the line been commemorated in the sort of heritage landscape along the line? And of course, a lot of that has been largely, again, a Eurocentric perspective, but not entirely. So, you had those, I mean, the Cameleers, for instance, are, reasonably well memorialized. I think, there is a physical memorial to the work of the Cameleers, but at particular spots like the telegraph station at Barrow Creek, which was a site of, Aboriginal conflict there was a site of an Aboriginal attack to kind of drive out the Europeans, that is commemorated there through a European memorial to the Aboriginal station hand and the telegraph line operator who were speared and killed in that attack. But behind that, we can see a story about Aboriginal resistance to the colonisation of their country and the defence of their country. So, I mean, the built landscape gives us another way of thinking about how to retell the memories of the line.
And these days, the Alice Springs Telegraph Station tells the story of the telegraph, but also its later life as the bungalow, which was a centre for the removal of children from their families and communities. So in some ways, it's hard, you have to work hard to not tell those stories as transcultural in some ways, but there are points at which that is still done.
Thank you very much, both. And unfortunately, I think we're getting pretty close to the end of the hour, so I won't have time for any more questions. I'd just like to say a very big thank you to both Amanda Nettlebeck and Mandy Paul for presenting today, and also for the team in putting this together. Now, the next Material Histories event, as you can see on your slide, is on Friday the 22nd of August, entitled Colonial Tourism Objects of Martindale Hall. So please look out for that and register your attendance. Thank you everyone for coming and for your interest and participation. And just to remind you again that we do welcome proposals for future seminars, and please see the Materials Histories page on the Old Treasury Building website for how to do so. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and the weekend.